When it comes to the life of a child, no one has a more important role than the parents. We're the ones that teach them right and wrong. We're the ones who encourage them to work hard and pursue their dreams. But most importantly, we're the ones who protect them. We decide what they can watch, where they can go, who they hang out with. And yeah, parents need to know what they're learning in school. But lately, that hasn't been the case. Parents have been completely cut off from the classroom. Why? Because lefty school districts are sneaking in curriculum about white guilt and gender fluidity and graphic sex. Well, Republicans have had enough, and they came up with the Parents' Bill of Rights. It's nothing crazy. It would just allow us, the parents, to be in the know.
Nearly 20 states are pushing to give parents more control, but educators worry that empowering parents would push many teachers out of the classroom, and not all parents agree with the bill either.
We fight it! We fight it! We fight it! Busloads of angry moms and dads marching on Congress today. We fight it! They're pushing back on a bill set for a vote later this week in the House that Republicans say is aimed at empowering parents, giving them more say over what their kids are taught. These parents disagree, saying the bill is about politics, not the well-being of kids.
The so-called parent power could reshape education.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Courageous Conversations about our schools. I'm the host, Ken Futernick, and today my guest and I will be talking about an issue that has added considerable fuel to today's culture wars in education. That issue centers around the rights of parents whose children attend public schools. Related to that issue, one of the most widely publicized actions that took place last year was Florida's Parental Rights in Education bill that became law in 2022. Often referred to now as the Don't Say Gay bill, this policy prohibited teaching about sexual identity and gender orientation from kindergarten through third grade. An updated bill introduced this year, just a few weeks ago, would extend that prohibition to eighth grade. The bill also stipulates that school employees in any K-12 school in Florida can't ask students for their preferred pronouns, nor can school staff share their own pronouns with students if they do not correspond with their sex. In California, where some of my guests are from, a bill was introduced recently that would have required school districts to notify parents in writing within 3 days if a student is identifying at school as a gender that does not align with the child's sex on their birth certificate. That bill, AB 1314, never got out of committee, so it's effectively dead. But bills like this one and the one in Florida represent a new wave of concerns by people, including some participating in our conversation today, that when it comes to public education, parents' rights need to be expanded, that parents need and deserve much more power than they currently have. And not just about sexual and gender identity, but about things like curriculum and the guest speakers that are invited to come to school and the books students have access to in the library. These are some of the questions we're going to consider today. What rights should parents have that they don't currently have? What rights do students have? And what if those rights conflict with parents' rights? And the third one is, what rights do the people or taxpayers of a state have when it comes to the kind of education students get in public schools? And I have to say, I'm personally very eager to hear what my guests have to say about this. So let's meet them. Will Johnson, let's start with you. Introduce yourself to our listeners.
Yes, thanks, Ken. I'm Will Johnson. I am a parent of three boys, 10, 8, and 6 years old, and I have attended public schools, and my wife and I recently moved with them back from Colorado and home to Minnesota to be with their grandparents and their cousins. So really glad to be on. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great. Thanks for joining us. Chris, let's go to you next.
Hi, I'm Chris Hasagawa. I'm the president of a school board in Spreckles, California. Spreckles is a little ways between Monterey and Salinas. In the course of my career, I've been a middle school and high school, I'm an elementary school teacher. I've been a middle school principal. I've been the president of the teachers union. I've been at a university, taught teacher education, and now I'm in a school board role. And we've had a lot of time thinking about some of these issues. So it's nice to be able to talk about them.
And Chris, you're also a parent, right?
I'm also a parent. I got 2 grown kids that went through the public schools.
Great. And Jordanos, we're going to come to you next.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jordanos Lemma, and I'm a current junior in high school, and I reside in Pennsylvania.
Great. Nice to have you a part of this conversation today, Jordanos. And finally, we have Tanya.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tanya Kravchuk. I am a mom of 4. My youngest is 4, and the oldest is 15. So I have the full gamut. I am a current trustee on the San Juan Unified School District Board, which is in Sacramento County. And I am also an immigrant from Ukraine. I went to kindergarten here, so I went through the public education system in America.
Terrific. Thanks for being part of this. Now, before we jump into today's conversation, let me just remind our listeners that this podcast is intended to be kind of a culture war antidote. It's for people who are willing to be curious rather than confrontational, to listen, to understand, and to show empathy rather than to yell or shame or score points. We're not avoiding conflict or differences in perspective. We're just looking for healthy conflict, not the kind of toxic conflict that usually causes people to dig their heels more deeply into what they already believe. So let's jump right into the first question I have for all of you, and I'm going to ask that you take no more than about 2 minutes to respond to the question. And that question is, with regard to public schools, what rights should parents have that they don't currently have? Will, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, well, I think to start, I think that the relationship between parents and teachers and schools work best when they partner together, when they do talk like we're talking today and reach out and seek to understand from a place of a good intention. So that's important to start out with. But I think parents' rights are fundamental rights. We are our child's first educator. We have the primary responsibility for our kids' upbringing. And we know that in our heart, right? We just know that. But it's also been reiterated by the Supreme Court over the decades that we have the fundamental right to direct the upbringing of our children. And so, what rights should we have that we don't? Well, I think part of it is parents should know their current rights and exercise them more so than I think they do today. So, legal rights such as the PPRA, the People Protection Rights Act, where there's a strong support for curriculum transparency in that, and gives the parents the right to opt their kids out of surveys that probe into their political or religious or other kind of personal topics. They have FERPA, which is the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, which gives parents the right to access their child's medical records, at school. Or Freedom of Information Act requests, which give parents additional rights to understand what's going on in the schools. Opting your kids out of sex education if you choose to do that. That's a right. Even in a state like Minnesota, we have the ability to kind of take it a step further, where they give parents the right to opt out of any curriculum and have a kind of reasonable alternative instruction presented to them. So knowing your current rights, I think, is important. I also think one thing that the parents don't have that we should really consider today is not just making surveys opt out, but making them opt in. Really kind of helping to foster this awareness that parents should have of what their kids are learning, and then choosing if they want their kids exposed to certain surveys or books, things like that. And then I'd say the last thing is around making sure that parents are not kept out of mental health, physical health related discussions and decisions that are happening at school. I think that's an increasing concern that I hear from parents that just they want to make sure they're not cut out of that. That's at the core of the parent and child relationship and should be preserved. So those rights, they come with responsibilities, right, to exercise them and to do so in a constructive way. But I think if we can achieve those things, we're going to do better for our parents, schools, and kids.
Great, thank you for that. So, Jordanos, how about if you go next and respond to the same question that Will responded to about the rights of parents and what rights they should have that perhaps they don't have now?
Yeah, so when I was reading this question, the first thing that came to mind was that parents have the right to be involved in their child's education and to receive information about the child's academic process or progress and what's happening in the classroom. But I do think that the parents' right shouldn't infringe upon the rights of other students or the ability of teachers to provide a quality education. For example, if it's limiting the child's exposure to important topics, whether it's about, I do think that sex education needs to be taught to students age appropriately. For example, that if a student is opted out of that, it could limit their exposure to it, which is necessary for their own personal development. And I think overall, it's important to balance parents' rights to their beliefs with their child's right to comprehensive education. But we also need to consider what parents may do that infringe on the teacher's ability to teach.
Great, Jordanos. Tanya, let's hear from you. Your thoughts on the same question about parent rights and perhaps the rights they should have that they don't currently have.
Yeah, so I agree with Will. I think that parents have every right to seek accountability, choice, and transparency in their children's education. And here in California, we are fortunate that parent rights are pretty clearly identified in our education code. I think the shift that has occurred in our culture and in our country is really an argument of definition. And what does that mean? And what do we as a country mean by parental rights? Because many will argue that parents already have all of those rights. And to Will's point, he's talking about parents being more informed and expanding on those. And I totally agree. I was one of those parents that in 2020, thinking that I was an informed parent, hearing some of the things that my children are hearing in their Zoom classes, I was pretty surprised, and my surprise surprised me. And so I started to dig in a little bit more, about what's all involved. And I think what has occurred, and really this movement, the parental rights movement, is because we're realizing that the shift has occurred from parents being the primary relationship and the primary group, for lack of a better word, that has the responsibility of their children's education and making the decisions about what's best for them, has shifted to slowly we're a partner in their education, we are involved in their education, and then, whoa, we're a terrorist. So that shift had occurred, and parents, rightly so, I think, are upset that the rights that we have been guaranteed in the Constitution and in Ed Code and in various public policies, it doesn't translate to the classroom. So my statement to that would be not so much an expansion of our current rights, but really an enforcement of those. And what does that look like? And here in California, one of my primary concerns as a parent has to do around healthcare. As a parent, I think I should be making the decisions for my children regarding their healthcare. And we have all these rules and all of these laws about transparency in advertising. And I can no longer bring homemade cupcakes to my child's classroom because someone might have an allergy. But then someone who's completely does not know my child or their medical history can make a decision about their physical body and not even tell me about it. I think that has crossed so many boundaries. So that definition of parental rights, I think, needs to have a larger conversation about that.
I want to just ask you to clarify something you said at the end, because you gave an example of schools making decisions about your child's health. Can you give us an example of what that might include?
Yeah, what I'm talking about is things like puberty blockers or hormones, or even taking my child to possibly get an abortion. Those kinds of things that schools can make decisions about and have, these secrecy policies about not sharing that information with the parents.
Chris, go ahead.
My concern, well, I don't think I've heard very many things here that I disagree with. My concern is that I think that every parent has the right to manage their child's education, but I don't know that necessarily gives them the right to manage all of the children's education in a way that meets their, their particular belief system. For example, we had a lot of people that picketed our schools and our school districts over the issue of wearing masks. And some people would picket us because they didn't believe that masks were necessary in this particular case. And they wanted us to not have any of the students wear masks. And then on alternative days, we got picketed by people that thought everybody should be wearing masks and that masks protected their kids in the school. And we, as a school board, made a decision that we thought was best for all of the schools. We had people that were passionate on both sides of that. And because they had those belief systems, they had their kids wear masks or not wear masks. Well, they have the right to have their kids do what they think is right, but they don't have the right to affect everybody in that system. So I think that's important. When I was in Oregon, I would go around and talk about my parents' experience during World War II, and was blocked from going into one of the high schools because there was a parent that said this didn't happen, that the Japanese were not sent to internment camps during World War II. And he objected so strongly to that and said that it had never happened in the United States, that they didn't allow me to go into the school. That was my experience. I didn't, it's not because it was me, it was because he made a decision based on what he believed that affected everybody in that school. And he certainly could have pulled his kid out. That was his right, but he didn't have the right to block that for the whole school. Turning now to the issue of student rights, I think there are times when for the protection of that student, there are things that in the state of California, there's a law that says if a student comes to the school and identifies and says, we want to be called this name and we need to, react with these pronouns, the school has an obligation to respond to that. And we also are not required to tell the parents about it. As a parent, that makes my hair stand up. But a parent that's having conversations with their kids on a regular basis might have known that before it turned up at the school. And the kids that are not having conversations with their parents, who are not having parents that are participating in that part of their life, may be endangered by having that reported to their parents. And so I think there are instances of where, for the protection of the child, the school, and in this case, the school needs to follow the state law. We don't have any choice about that. But like I said, when I first heard that, it made my hair as a parent stand up. And now I feel like, now that I understand it better, that there's a good reason for that.
So I think we've all had a chance to, all of you have had a chance to lay out your response to the question about parent rights, just to sort of set the groundwork for our next question and next couple of questions. Chris, you kind of did answer both the first and second questions when you talked about a little bit about the rights, and we'll come back to you and see if you want to add anything. But the next question I want to focus on is, what rights do students have? And what if those rights conflict with parents' rights? And do students have a right to share their preferred gender identity with teachers without concern that teachers would be required, as the bill I mentioned in California that was introduced that doesn't look like it's going to go anywhere, but it was introduced. If that was had passed, it would require teachers to inform parents within 3 days of their gender preference. And so I don't want to go around and ask each of you about this more basic question about students' rights in general and what happens if they conflict with with parents' rights. Jordanos, let me start with you on that one.
But when it comes to students' rights, I think ultimately we all can agree that students have the right to a well-balanced education. And we don't really see that in some parts of the country, with students not having access to certain things while other students having an abundance of opportunities and resources. And when it comes to students' rights and parents' rights, when we don't know what the situation at home is for certain students, and it's really hard to see whether or not these students are in a safe environment at home. And if the student is telling things to teachers or administrators, I don't think that it should be, especially when it's something that the student may not be ready to tell their parents. I don't think that teachers and administrators should tell parents, because of what dangers the students may face at home because of it, whether they have different beliefs or going back to like the gender topic, all that. Students' rights needs to be prioritized in that, because it may endanger them. And overall, I think that students really deserve a chance to be really open about themselves at schools, because schools are a microcosm of society, basically, especially when it's a super diverse school. You're meeting people, and when it's a public school, you're meeting people that come from all different backgrounds and circumstances. And I think that students have the right to be honest with themselves in the environment, which is something many cannot do at home.
Thank you for that. And Tanya, you raised some concerns about parents not necessarily knowing what kind of healthcare support teachers or educators are providing. And Jordanos brought up the question, well, what if a student doesn't feel safe sharing that with the parent, but they do share it at school? How do you, in your mind, resolve that problem, a potential problem?
Yeah, I think it's natural for children to worry about their parents' reaction to certain information. You know, they might be uncomfortable with sharing certain things with their parents, but that discomfort has never dissuaded teachers from sharing other information with parents about possibly conduct problems or absenteeism or poor grades or some other kind of negative information that has not dissuaded teachers from sharing that information in the past. And unfounded concern about potential abuse is not a valid criterion for keeping information from parents. Laws exist about abuse and neglect that protect children, and teachers as mandatory reporters should absolutely report abuse, but we can't make assumptions about what may or may not happen in the home, because we think we just can't make those assumptions. And that's the shift that I was talking about earlier, because by virtue of this definition, the school gets to decide what is the greater danger. That particular teacher or administrator gets to decide that there is a greater danger of telling the parent something about the child than possibly doing something that is irreversible to that child and to their health in the future. So instead of the parent making a decision about what's more dangerous, it's now the school that's making that decision. There's, I don't know, at last count, but there's like 45,000 people, I think, that are on the detransitioners Reddit page that talk about, you know, that they transitioned earlier in their life. I'm talking about sex transition, and then they change their mind about it later. And when we make decisions that are so serious, that affect a child's life for the rest of their future, that's really the crux of our question here. Who gets to make that decision? Who gets to determine the criterion for deciding that?
This is Ken, the host, and after listening to this episode, I decided to add an audio footnote here about the information that Tanya just shared. She said there are about 45,000 people who are members of a discussion group on a social media platform called Reddit. People who talk about detransitioning, the process some trans people undergo to return to their gender assigned at birth. At my request, Tanya sent me a link to the Reddit discussion group, and she's right. There are about 45,000 people who are part of this discussion group. And if you're curious about why some people choose to detransition, I've provided a link on our website, schoolconversations.org, to that discussion group so you can learn more. But I also want to be sure we don't conclude anything about the actual numbers of people who regret making the decision to transition based on the fact that there are 45,000 members of a group that discuss this topic online. If you are interested in that question about numbers, I'd urge you to look at some of the peer-reviewed studies that have been conducted in recent years about detransitioning and transition regret. I'd also urge you to think about and look for studies that address a different question. What are the psychological effects for young people who have wanted to transition but have been unable to obtain the emotional and professional support needed to explore that option? Okay, back to the podcast. If we could, Tanya, just go back to something that's far more likely to happen and not that unusual. And that is that you have and I don't know that any teachers make decisions for students about gender transitions. It's made with medical doctors and lots of other people. It isn't. But let's say a student comes to school and says, I identify as queer, and tells the teacher, and I don't want to tell my parents because I don't think they would like it, and I think they may abandon me or they may not love me anymore. And that isn't something necessarily that a teacher would go to the Child Protective Service and say the parent feels unsafe at home in terms of how they're going to be regarded. And I'll just share an example with you. My daughter works in Sacramento. She's an educator of sorts, and she's currently mentoring a student who is homeless, high school student, because she went home and announced to her parents that she was queer. And they said, then you can't live here anymore. So there are countless numbers of stories of people who have threatened to commit suicide, who have committed suicide. We're not talking about gender-altering drugs. We're talking about simply coming out and having your parents or your family find out about it. So I think what Jordanis was referring to, and it's a concern I share, is that if a student wants to just simply be out and express who they are to a teacher or to others, and they want support from them just to be accepted or want advice on how they can cope with that, I think what you're suggesting is that parents have a right to know about that, and that the danger of not telling them is greater and the risk that it puts the child in.
I think that parents deserve to know what's happening. If children are spending, 8 hours a day in school, that's the bulk of their time. And they may not have the full picture. They may not have some information, and we can't assume the worst. If a child is sharing that they're scared for their safety, they're scared for their future, then that's a different argument. And we can talk about bringing in other support systems and other people who are in that child's life. But I would want the parent to be involved in that conversation without that assumption that something's going to go completely wrong. And also to your some of the statements that you made, when we're talking about a child coming out as queer or sharing some information, I think part of this conversation about parental rights for me would have to go further back in time to the time where we have conversations about this in school, about pronouns, about gender identity, about LGBTQ and that kind of thing. Where did that child acquire that definition? Where did that child acquire that information? Who are they having conversations that have led them to this place? because children are highly suggestible. So if they're having conversations with the teacher, that means that they're comfortable sharing that definition with the teacher. So something in that relationship already happened that they have that basis. So I kind of went on a tangent, but going back to this, I think that parents deserve the opportunity. If we're not going to say the word right, then I say that they at least deserve the opportunity to be given the benefit of the doubt and be included in that conversation, because they have the responsibility of taking care of that child.
Well, let me come to you, and you can respond to the question and or to the comments you've heard so far. But again, the question, what rights do students have, and what if they conflict with the rights of parents?
Yeah, I think, to the first part of that question, what rights do students have? Well, they certainly have First Amendment rights, which means freedom to speech and freedom from compelled speech, as well as beliefs. Freedom of religion. They have, Title VI of the Civil Rights Amendment protection, which means they can't be treated differently based on the color of their skin. Title IX, where they can't be treated differently based on their sex. And I think they should have a voice, with student advisory groups, things like that in schools. I've seen those work well to have a seat at the table in that regard. I think, to the topic we were addressing in the previous comments. I mean, schools are in a tough position on this, and I think we can all agree, with that. If a student is truly in danger, I think schools can play a role in encouraging the child to get help, right? To kind of help to help that situation get figured out and resolved in the right way. But I think, as Tanya was saying, it's a slippery slope if we start putting a wedge between the parent and the child. We need a permission slip to give our kids Tylenol or to have them go on a field trip. And so if we're talking about just key crucial topics like, again, their mental health, their physical decisions, we should default to including parents in those crucial topics, and I think leave that decision in the realm of the family, in as much as we can do so. One thing I think is interesting, I've seen around is things like the Given Name Act, which says that a school can't, discuss or call a child a different pronoun than what matches their biological sex, unless their parent gives permission. So kind of defaulting to that mindset, I think, is gonna lead to a healthier relationship and more of a constructive partnership between parent and school.
Well, I'm just wondering if you might go along with this thinking that, the vast majority of parents are do a great job of it and are truly concerned. There are some parents who don't necessarily respond in ways that make children feel safe in doing what you suggested. And ideally, that's what we want the parents to be involved. But I guess I still come back to kids who say, if I tell my parents about this, terrible things are going to happen, and not necessarily the things that rise to the level of having to report it to CPS, but they just won't love me, or, I'll become homeless, or they'll just ignore me. And there are lots of stories of students who feel that way, and stories of that actually happening, like the example I gave. Does that concern you, that possibility, or that reality, I should say?
Yeah, it does concern me. I mean, I don't think any of us would want, that to happen if we were in that situation. And so I think there's kind of a delineation in my mind of being sympathetic to the student, helping them, like maybe talking through, well, how would you approach this with your parents, right? Let's talk about ways to bring it up or to address it. If there's true, danger, as you referenced, go and do your duty, per the Child Protective Services obligations, things like that. But there's a delineation of helping the child kind of manage through those thoughts versus affirming and taking it as your role as a school to help them down the path of, in this case, gender transition, things like that. So in my mind, there's two things. There are two different ways to look at it. Hope that helps.
Yeah. Thank you. Chris, I would love to hear your thoughts, and then Tanya, I'll come back to hear you. I know you wanted to weigh in this, but Chris, your thoughts on what you've been hearing.
One of the things that I always think about as a school board member is if I knew that the parental situation was one where they had conversations on a regular basis and they interacted with their children and that their children were a partner in this educational program, then I would be much relieved. But unfortunately, sometimes as the school administrator and when I was a teacher, we would get instances where that wasn't the reality and the kid was really going to be in danger. For example, we talked about mandated reporting a little while ago. And one time when I was a basketball coach, I had this kid that was covered in bruises. And so I felt like this kid had the possibility of endangerment, and we reported him to child services, protective services. And the parent came in madder than heck. And he explained to us that the kid had fallen down a hill on his bicycle. And the kid didn't share that with us. You know, when we asked him, how did this happen? We just saw all the bruises. And he was madder than heck. But when I talked to the parent and said, so you're mad at me for reporting this. Are you saying that if I saw your child bruised and battered, I should say nothing? And he said, no. You know, I understand the process. And he went back and had this very wonderful conversation with his son. And they talked about how important this was. And it was a good parental situation. I mean, it was a teaching opportunity for both of them. On the other hand, when I was a principal, we had a kid that came in that was battered. And the father's response was, I'm going to take the kid home and beat him up because he said something to you. Completely different parental response. And we knew that that kid was endangered. We'd already referred him to Child Protective Services, but he was in a situation where, you know, he only had that father to live with. And I won't follow that scenario up. But my point is that if we could assume that everybody had the best parental relationship and the best environment to grow up in, then I don't think that this issue would be as big. Our problem is that we really do have to protect some of our kids from their parents. We don't know that. I'd love to make the assumption in every case that the parent is going to be responsible and caring of the child and has their interest at heart. But my reality is that that doesn't always happen. And so sometimes we make assumptions the other way, and we invite the parents to, interact with the kid, interact with us. And a lot of times if we've misjudged that, the parent can make that okay, and the school can make that okay. We want to make sure that we do the safest thing for the kid.
Tanya, you wanted to offer a comment. I want to let you make it now, and then I'm going to move to our third question in just a moment.
I did want to share, in case this is interesting for anyone, that I actually spent about a decade working in social services. So I worked at a domestic violence shelter and then at a shelter for kids who have been abused and neglected. So for almost 10 years, I was surrounded by really horrific cases and seeing the results, when kids were not protected. So if anything, I just like to say that I'm not ignorant about what can happen when a child is not in a safe situation. But I think that there is a danger in assuming that the school knows best, because parents and families really are the core unit that make up our society. And when we're already assuming, then we go back to where I started this conversation of saying it's a us versus them mentality, as opposed to, working on something together and having the full picture. And I think what's really, really difficult for anyone in a school setting or any situation where you see something in a child and you want what's best for them, but the parent disagrees with you. And so there's also this tug of war of, should I share this information with the parent if they're not going to do anything about it anyway? Or if they're going to disagree with me and they're going to do the complete opposite thing of what I think is best for the child. And in those situations, I would still say the parent is in charge. And so I think the school still has the responsibility of sharing that information, even if those parents end up doing the opposite thing of what you want them to do, with the major caveat of if there is no abuse. If they're just not affirming, if they're not supporting something that you think is right, unfortunately for that teacher, for the parent gets to decide. And when that child is of age, they can make their own decisions. But for that time period, if they are a minor and there is no abuse involved, the parent has ultimate say.
The thing that concerns me is the extraordinarily high rate of suicide among LGBTQ students. So it's not so much trusting the educators to know what to do, it's trusting, in my mind, trusting a student who says, my life, I think, would be in danger. Nothing has happened yet except threats or just my belief that if I were to come out with my parents, or that I would be not loved in the same way, and the depression I'm already feeling would get worse. And I've talked to lots of teachers who talk about kids that come to them and say, I'm seriously contemplating suicide. And I agree with Will, you have to do everything you can to try to get them the help and support. And teachers are not always and often in a position to provide that kind of help if someone's feeling suicidal. But I worry greatly about the California bill that doesn't seem like it's going anywhere, but it could in other states, where teachers are obligated, without any question at all, not being able to do what Will said, within 3 days to out the student about their concerns about gender. And then we're putting all of the onus back on parents, some of whom we know aren't very supportive, aren't the kind of parents that Chris talked about that we hope they would be. And so it's complicated, and these are tough decisions. When anyone reports something to CPS, it's agonizing, because in Chris's case, you might be telling CPS about something that had nothing to do with abuse, and you know the parents are going to be upset, and they were. Eventually, they came around and saw that you did the right thing, and they understood it, but it had to be agonizing to do that. Jordanis, I can't see you, but I just want to see if you want to offer a comment before we go on to our third question.
I do agree that teachers and other staff at schools don't have the right to give like hormone blockers or anything like that to students, because that is the parents' right. Like, definitely, ultimately, that's the parents' decision on what to do with their child's healthcare. But when it comes to children and students wanting to have a trusted adult in their life when they can't tell things to their parents, I think that teachers don't have the say to tell the parent. And I don't think parents ultimately have like the ultimate authority on whether or not they should know about what the student is talking about in school.
Thank you for that. I'm going to move on to our third question, which I think is a really intriguing one that is often not talked about. But the question is, what rights do the people of a state, the taxpayers of a state, or of our nation for that matter, have when it comes to the kind of education students get in public schools? And I want to read to you an academic standard in California. And this is for 10th grade students in history and social science. And the standard is this, that students will analyze the Nazi policy of pursuing racial purity, especially against the European Jews, its transformation into the final solution in the Holocaust that resulted in the murder of 6 million Jewish civilians. Now, I'm wondering, this may seem like a far-fetched question, and I'm really eager to see what you have to say about it. But in fact, there are states now that are passing laws that would make that kind of teaching very difficult, and teachers could be penalized for doing it. But what if parents of students in a local district said they didn't want that taught, that it might make their students feel too uncomfortable. Or you have parents like the ones that Chris referred to that didn't believe that the Japanese internment in that case happened, but with respect to this standard, that the Holocaust didn't happen. And there are people out there that believe that, contrary to the facts. Should they be able to override state standards, I guess is my question. And again, there's some states, upwards of 9 of them, that have passed laws that say that teachers in high schools can't teach curriculum that causes students to feel discomfort. And I guess in my mind, if you were to teach about Japanese internment or about slavery, about the Holocaust, I'd be surprised and in fact quite worried if students didn't feel a sense of discomfort about some of the terrible things that have happened in our past. So let me open that up to all of you. And Will, let me come to you and let you respond first to that question about the obligations to the people of a state.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that everybody should feel like they have a voice in these discussions, because it's parents and teachers and school administrators. I mean, we're kind of the closest to it on the day to day, but really as a taxpayer, I mean, you're funding public schools, and even outside of that, I mean, what we teach our kids in K through 12 education, it has an impact on the type of citizens they become, and what our next generation looks like in terms of how they kind of carry the American ideas forward. And so I think it's important to know that everybody should have a voice. Well, what does that voice look like, right? I think that everybody should feel that that everybody should be involved in their school board elections. Right? It's frankly, I think, one of the most important elections that we have, because school boards have a real role in choosing curriculum, in kind of taking the state standards that I think should be pretty broad at the state level, and then kind of framing them up for the local community. What is the community's needs? What reflects the community's values, and making them kind of manifest in the local community. So I think being involved in your school board elections is an important way to make your voice heard in this. I think giving feedback on state standards. Recently in Minnesota, we have had a fairly significant overhaul in some of the state standards, and there was a lot of people who wrote in, gave public comment, different organizations that spoke as well on behalf of people in their organization. So that's another important way to be involved in the state. Of course, being involved locally is the most important. But to your question, or to your point about kind of the Holocaust denying or Japanese internment, things like that, I think a good default position is to teaching full history, which in our case, if you think about American history, it means the good and the bad. And so when we think about what we should teach, it should be we should teach our nation's real flaws, and then also like Jordanis was saying earlier, students need a balanced education. I think it's very true in history. They should learn the bad and the great good that our country has been able to achieve by more fully living up to our founding principles, and that it's going to take those founding principles to make the progress that we need to continue to make. So defaulting to kind of teaching everything within an age appropriate way, I think is a good way to do it. And it's not necessarily being hesitant about discomfort, right? I think to me it's more about making sure we don't stereotype kids based on things like their race, and say that because the pigment of my skin is this, I either have that dictates what I'm able to achieve or not achieve, things of that nature. That's, I think, more of what people are getting at.
Thanks for that, Will. I just want to ask a clarifying question. If people that were concerned about the education of their students in a particular district got together and campaigned to get on a school board, and the majority of them were Holocaust deniers or Japanese internment deniers, and they said, we're not in this district going to teach that standards that other students or teachers are expected to teach, just as a matter of principle, and your concern about parent rights, Would that be okay with you?
Well, I think that that gets back to kind of what do the state standards call for? And it's kind of a balancing act because you need appropriately broad state standards. But at the same time, I think it's fair to call out. That's another thing I've seen in state standards recently where they add, we will teach about the Holocaust, or we will teach about Japanese internment, things like that. Those types of things that are just factually true, that I think the vast majority of people would agree with, I think are fair to point out in a state standard. The other thing too is I would be surprised, maybe I'm just naive, but I'd be surprised if a school board, if people who ran on that platform actually could win a majority of the community in this day and age.
Yeah. The problem, Will, is that the majority of people, as you said earlier, don't vote in school board elections. I mean, we're lucky if we get 18% of our population voting in school board elections. And so, yeah, taking over the majority of the people in our county would probably be pretty hard. Taking over the majority of the 18% that are voting might not be as hard. Yeah.
It's a good point, Chris. I think it's one reason why we need people to be involved and plugged in for that reason.
Ken, if I can jump in.
Please do.
Okay, so one of the things that you will learn as a young board member is that you have all sorts of people coming in to speak at the board meetings. You give them 3 minutes, but anybody can really speak. And for a good part of a year, we had a man come in and tell us every week that we ought not to be teaching anything about the United States history except for what mattered to the white races, because they were the most important races in America, and they were the ones that had made everything happen. And he said that week after week. He was the person, month after month, at each of our school board meetings, we would cut him off after 3 minutes, and he would struggle with that. And he wasn't even from our district, but he would make these impassioned speeches at each of these things. So we know that in the larger community, there is, these movements that organize themselves to come around. We're a teeny district. We don't even have a high school. And he spent his time coming to really pound us on critical race theory and how that was destroying the, educational, while his perspective, that it was destroying educational values. And he wasn't even from our district. So there are these organized groups that come in and are trying to push things. I would say about this question is to remember that parents are part of the government. As Will pointed out, you vote, as you get elected to board members, you're part of that process, and the legislative process and all these other things that we're responding to. So there are other ways to deal with that. I think that the collective body has a right to expect that their students become citizens that can contribute in a significant way, and that's where the standards and all of those things come in. The school board, much as we talk about it, there's not that much power in the school board when you see the state standards and those kinds of things. I think what we focus on is trying to make sure that people have an opportunity to be heard, that students have an opportunity to be served well, and that really that the state, federal government, the larger community is served well by the processes that go on in the public schools.
Thank you, Chris. Jordanis, I want to hear your thoughts on this question about the rights of people in a state to have a certain type of education.
Yeah, so when I was listening to what Chris was talking about the guy who was coming to the board meetings and wasn't in the district and just spewing racist rhetoric, when it comes to the people in the state, I think that it's important to recognize what the people in the school actually need, rather than people who don't even have kids in the school district, or don't really have an influence on the school. So I think it's important to realize what teachers need, what administrators need, and most importantly, what students and parents need. And when Will was talking about state standards, and when it comes to that, I think it's important that students deserve that well-balanced education, which is the rights and wrongs in history, and none of that should be covered up, or we shouldn't just be teaching the rights in history. And when it comes to people feeling uncomfortable in history classes, it's normal to feel uncomfortable. I would be concerned if someone didn't feel uncomfortable when learning about slavery or learning about the Holocaust, because I feel uncomfortable when I learn about those things, because they're heavy on the heart, those type of topics, and it hurts to hear about people being killed or discriminated against simply because of the color of their skin. And if we are going based on what students feel comfortable with, what limitations does that have? And to what extent are we saying, oh, well, one student doesn't feel comfortable with that, then we shouldn't teach it to all students? And I don't think that an individual's opinion should infringe on the education of all students when it comes to that.
Thank you, Jordanis. And Tanya, I want to let you weigh in on this question, or on anything you've heard from the other people on the panel.
Yeah. Well, I agree with that Spanish philosopher that those who do not study history are bound to repeat it. We absolutely need to keep studying these horrific things that occurred, and we want our students to be critical thinkers. The only way they get there is if we share the full picture, and they are taught to reason and taught to decide for themselves, because it impacts and it's relevant to nowadays decisions. My home country of Ukraine in 2022 was invaded. A sovereign democratic nation was invaded by another country. In my lifetime, I never thought that that would be something that happened. I thought that that's something relegated to the history books. And then it's happening right now. And right now I have to make decisions about those impacts on the world and how we deal with that as a country, as a family, as an individual. And we have to continue learning those. It's imperative to who we are and who we are as a democracy, who we are as a people, what kind of decisions we make about our future. We have to keep studying that. There's not a way that we can, when there's one person who comes and is super obnoxious and is saying something at a board meeting, that's one person. I would really like to think that in our democracy, the majority of the people are not going to agree with just that one individual who's denying facts.
Tanya, I want to put the same question to you that I put to Will, just because I want to get at this tension between parent rights and the rights of a people in a state or a nation. But I suspect when the next standards are written, there's going to be a standard in there that talks about world history, and it talks about the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. But just hypothetically, if there was a place in this country, a school district where you had people that were sympathetic to what they're hearing from Russia, that it wasn't an invasion, that it somehow was land that belonged to Russia, that they were reclaiming, whatever that narrative is, and we don't want to teach that standard, would it be consistent with your views about parental empowerment that they ought to have it that way, if that's what a majority of parents, or if they had a majority of the school board duly elected, and not teach that state standard?
It's a tricky question, and I want to answer it honestly, because in keeping with my earlier statement, I was saying that parents have, the ultimate right for their children. And yet I guess I could envision a scenario where maybe that would happen, and where we're denying facts, or someone has a different interpretation of something, and yet the majority of the people are, let's say, on the wrong side of the understanding. So I would have to examine that more, because it would be very difficult for me to accept that something like that would happen. But of course, there's like this saying that the winners write the history books, right? We've heard that said. And I guess that's true to a certain extent. And so I can't answer that completely because I would just, in my maybe Pollyanna kind of outlook, like to think that that wouldn't happen. And yet I can see where maybe that would. And I think back to what some of Will's statements about, state education code and some of our federal laws, they're there because we have larger than just that, that immediate community. We have a democracy and we have ways of making policy and state law and federal law. So I'd like to think that that couldn't happen, and therefore I wouldn't need to answer that question. But if that were to happen, then, gosh, I'm back to where I'm saying I don't know.
Yeah, I think you're conceding, like all of us do this. Some of these questions are really hard, but I will say it's not totally hypothetical. I go back to what's happening in some states that are pulling parts out of the curriculum that with these sort of general statements, if it causes anyone to feel a sense of discomfort. And so it's very vague and maybe deliberately so, and which then means that teachers who are worried about losing their teaching credential, which is the penalty in some states, if kids come home and they say, I felt just awful about what they told me happened in Ukraine, or what's happening now in Ukraine, or what happened in World War II with Japanese or the Holocaust. And in theory, it hasn't been tested yet, I don't think, but a teacher could lose his or her teaching credential because they taught it in a way that people felt uncomfortable. And as Jordanos pointed out, and I agree with her, wouldn't we all be a little surprised and concerned if students didn't feel a sense of discomfort? So it isn't totally hypothetical. Will, you wanted to offer a comment?
Yeah, and I think it does go back to Jordanos's point about being okay with being uncomfortable, right? And I think that's I would agree with that, and I think that's actually kind of at the root of a number of parents' concerns right now. Is it feels like diversity of thought isn't welcomed or is being increasingly pushed out, and what's coming in is more of kind of a rigid this opinion that I have is fact. And I think in an age appropriate way, right, we have to do these things, but I think that's part of a school's role is to help the kids become critical thinkers. They have to be presented with some diversity of thought. Now that doesn't mean that they should truly be pushed to question whether the Holocaust happened or not, but I think it's fair to have them talk through and think through some of these issues that are potentially and often very kind of hot button issues in today's culture. But I think if parents could see more of like a diversity of thought in those things, that this side's presented and this side's presented, now let's talk about it, students. I think that would ease some of parents' concerns, because some of the bills I've seen, again, I don't think it should just be if it causes discomfort. I as Jordanos said, I think we should welcome that to a degree. But it's more around compelled belief. Schools should not compel a student to think this way. Present both sides, and let's talk about it, because at the end of the day, if a student can come to their own conclusions, thinking through the available evidence, that's going to make them a better citizen.
Yeah, thanks for that. Chris, please.
Can I just jump on a soapbox really quickly here and really be cognizant of the danger I feel from minority, very small extremist positions, because as Will and I were talking about earlier, you don't have that many people voting in a school board election. Tanya talked about, she would have faith that the majority of the country wouldn't let some of these things happen. And I have that same faith in humanity and the American citizenry. But the people that actually participate in school board elections are relatively small, and they can be taken over. I think that we, as school board members, as parents, as people that are going to vote, I mean, Ken and I are old, but the rest of you are young enough. Think about your generation. How do you get them to turn out to the polls and actually do that kind of work that we're all agreeing is really important, and that they take a an opportunity to be part of the state government and part of the federal government and part of the school board that makes these decisions. They're all parents. And I just am really concerned that a very well-organized extremist small group could have power in our current system that they ought not to, and that's going to disturb all of us. We're not, I think collectively in this conversation, that's something that we ought to be concerned about.
So let me wind up here with a quick question and just go around to each of you and ask you what you take away from today's conversation. Is there anything that that you've learned, anything that you're going to take away and continue thinking about? And also just would love your thoughts on having this kind of conversation where no one was interrupting and people got a chance to share their point of view. I didn't sense any, I think what I perceived was healthy differences of opinion. No one was shaming or yelling at each other. And I just wonder what you think about the value of having conversations like this. So let me just go around. And Jordanos, let me start with you. And what's your takeaway from today?
I think my main takeaway from today was the importance of communicating with people from multiple perspectives. I think in society, we're so used to staying in our group, and people are used to just staying with people who have the same ideologies and same beliefs instead of going out and exploring different perspectives. And I think today's conversation really showed me different perspectives from parents and school board, which was really nice because just constantly being in a space with just students kind of makes me and other students think that only one opinion is right. And I think if we're able to actually engage and communicate with other perspectives, we can find common ground and actually find solutions.
That's beautifully said, Jordanos. I just have a question for you. You're a junior in high school, isn't that right?
Yeah.
Do you find that in your classrooms where you're talking about controversial subjects, maybe current events, you are encouraged and have an opportunity to talk with other students in a productive way who have different perspectives than your own?
Definitely, especially in my history class. My teacher does a really good job of facilitating the discussions and making sure that every student from multiple perspectives is heard, and we're able to actually have a healthy conversation and actually communicate what issues are happening.
And do you have a sense that that history teacher you just referred to is ever sort of drifted into the area of indoctrination and is trying to get you or other students to adopt a set of beliefs that he or she has?
No.
Okay. Because that's a charge that's being made a lot, that teachers, in having these controversial subjects, aren't really allowing for multiple voices, as Will said we should be doing, and that they're too often trying to push their own points of view. And I don't know that we have any data that supports that claim, but at least in your sampling of one, that's not how your history class goes. And I think all of us on the call here today are happy to hear that and probably support that. But Tanya, let me come to you and just what are your takeaways from today?
Thank you, everyone, for sharing your thoughts today. And thank you, Ken, for the invitation. I actually had earlier this month made a goal for myself of intentionally surrounding myself with people with diverse views. I represent a district that is the 9th largest in California. And, we have, even within my district, we have so much diversity, particularly in Sacramento County with the influx of refugees from different countries. We have schools that have, I think, 43 languages that are spoken, and just an individual school site. And I just really am trying to be intentional about surrounding myself with these views. And I agree with what Jordanos said, that, it just enriches your life. And when you have a conversation with someone and understand where they're coming from and why they believe what they believe, that can give you the platform for that conversation instead of making assumptions about someone and, already sticking kind of to your guns and knowing what you're going to say before you even hear them out. So I just appreciate the opportunity. And in general, I think it's such an important topic, and one that affects our families, our communities, and really just the future of our country. So I'm grateful to participate in this.
Yeah, Tanya, thanks so much for that. And I so admire what the goal that you set for yourself to intentionally reach out and be with people. And I think Donis was saying the same thing. She appreciated the fact that we're here together with different perspectives. And I want to encourage our listeners to listen to the interview I did with Peter Coleman. He's from Columbia University. He talks about toxic polarization, how we get out of it. But on our website, schoolconversations.org, is a link to an initiative that he helped start. It's called the Day-to-Day Political Courage Challenge. And it is really doing just what you said, Tanya. It begins the first week or so by examining your own biases and your own tendencies to sort of your sort of inner polarizer is what some refer to it as, and then just start having conversations with your friends about differences of opinion. And then the third step is to reach out, as you said, Tanya, to people that think different, have different perspectives, and intentionally make a point of listening to them and having them listen to you to see if there isn't common ground, to see if there aren't some misconceptions. And in some cases, just to have to agree to disagree, because you end up leaving saying, "Oh, well, we still disagree," but I empathize with you. You're a member of my school district, or you're a fellow citizen, you're a human being, and we have to keep these conversations going, because if we don't, the whole country falls apart. Chris, your thoughts on today?
Yeah, I really appreciate, Ken, the conversation. I mean, just the term conversation, to be doing that rather than doing a debate or doing a counterpoint or anything like that. So thank you for putting these together. I think courageous conversations is an important concept. And like I told you, I want to bring it to my school district so that we can talk about some things within the school district that we need to. I'm so encouraged that there is a school district that can bring up a Jordanis who is so articulate and thoughtful and thinks through these things. When I hear her talk, I have some confidence that there's some educators that are doing right, doing something that's really good. And I appreciated her participation in this. Couldn't have been easy. And then the last thing is that what I heard was more agreement than disagreement. As we talked about different kinds of things, I didn't hear anybody say anything that I violently disagreed with. I think that if we had more conversation on some of these topics, we would find more things that we agreed on than things that we disagreed on. I hear over and over, and I think over and over again, that if all the folks that had problems would have agreements, conversations like this, then we could solve a lot of these problems. The problems is we've got parents out there, or we've got citizens out there that don't want to have these kind of conversations, that they want to have just what they believed enforced. And that's problems for everybody. So I encourage more courageous conversations and hope we can involve more and more people in it.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on today?
Yeah, I would echo what everybody said. I think, in these days of social media, it's more important than ever to have conversations together like this, to be really intentional about it, especially when we're talking about such important topics like this, right? Because as Chris said, I think we often realize that, gosh, there's a lot of agreement on some of these important elements of this. I think what I learned, or really reminded me today, was just how important it is for parents and schools and school boards to be working together, to be involved and working together. Because I think schools and school boards have some real challenges they're working through right now with everything going on. And the more we're involved, the more parents are engaged, I think the better the outcome will be. So I think that's really what I took away. And so, yeah, I would just thank everyone for their insights and what I was able to learn from all of you. And let's keep the conversation going.
Yeah. Thanks for that. And I guess my just final thought is something that I have come to think recently that I'm really concerned about. And that is that I think maybe the single greatest threat to our well-being and to our school systems, to our communities, to our own personal health or relationships with loved ones in our nation, for that matter, is our inability or unwillingness to have conversations like this, to be civil, to listen, to try to find common ground, to show some compassion for our fellow citizens, even when, and sometimes because we disagree, but we do it in ways that we're coming from a genuine place, an honest place. And if we don't do that, I really worry about the future of our school systems and our country. If we do it like we did here, and more people do it and establish goals for themselves, like Tanya says she has done, is to deliberately go out and spend time with people who think differently than we do. I have great hope for our school systems. And, and the other thing is we as adults are models to our children. And if we are unable or unwilling to have civil conversations, to engage in dialogue like this, our students are going to see that and they're going to follow right along and do the same thing. And it will be even worse when the next generation gets older. But I have hope that we can do more of this. I find myself being part of, I consider myself being part of what some call the exhausted majority, people who are tired of this acrimony and this dysfunction and want to find a way out. And today, I think, is an example of a way out. So I want to thank all of you for being part of this courageous conversation. You will find this episode and all the other courageous conversations we've had on schoolconversations.org and on most podcasting platforms. So long, everyone.